Well, welcome to this episode of the Bailey Report. I'm your host, Javier Bailey. This is where you find some of the most in depth and contemporary discussions on today's issues and news. Today, I want to address this whole hoopla surrounding the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action. That decision, with the majority opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts, for all practical purposes, eliminated the use of remedial policies to address years and decades of discrimination in by colleges and universities in their admissions. Many years ago, there was a California decision that uh, that allowed affirmative action. So, and it was called affirmative action because colleges and universities were, for all practical purposes, required to take affirmative steps, positive steps towards eliminating and reducing systemic discrimination against Black and Hispanic students. Uh, well, let me tell you something. I'm going to shock many of you when I say this, but my response to the U.S. Supreme Court decision is good riddance. Good riddance. It is about time that we began standing up for ourselves and taking control of our own destiny. It was always an illusion. Let me tell you what former President Barack Obama said immediately after the Supreme Court decision was released. Barack Obama said affirmative action was never a complete answer in the drive towards a more just society. But for generations of students who had been systematically or systemically excluded from most of America's key institutions, it gave us the chance to show more than deserved a seat at the table. In the wake of the Supreme Court's recent decision, it's time to redouble our efforts. So if we're looking for ways to right now, if we're looking for ways to help right now, here are some things that we must consider. Obama went on to say back in college that he was one of the few Black students on his campus, and he was proud of getting into such a respected school. Barack Obama went to Harvard Law School. He also said that, but the fact is this: he belonged. And semester after semester, decade after decade, and for more than half a century, countless students like him showed they belonged. It was just the kids of color who benefited either. I mean, it wasn't the kids of color who benefited. Every student who heard a perspective they might not have encountered, who had an assumption challenged, who had their minds and their hearts open, gained a lot as well. It wasn't perfect, but there's no doubt it helped offer new ladders of opportunity for many of us. Now, Barack Obama is 100% correct that at the time that affirmative action became a matter of public policy, it was an immediate remedial effort to begin systemically and systematically integrating more Black and Hispanic students, more female students, more Asian students into the population of these large and some small private universities, wherein we had been systemically excluded for decades. But how long must that go on? It was actually an illusion for us to believe that it would remain forever. It was an illusion for us to believe that MBWE programs and other such programs that are designed to wipe away years and years and years of racism would remain on the books forever. In fact, it was inevitable that this day would come wherein these policies would be eliminated. So, what do we do now? Where do we go now? I look at it this way. One of the worst things that ever happened to the Black community was for us to begin eliminating our own institutions and businesses once we achieved legal integration. Once segregation was outlawed throughout the nation and the government forced businesses and forced universities and school systems and forced uh, 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 people selling their homes and forced uh, others to other institutions to take us in, to allow us in, uh, then we put our guards down. We began to think that we'd made it. We began to stop shopping in our own communities, stop going to school in our own communities. We stopped spending our money with Black merchants. And as a result of that, we saw our own institutions began to slide off. HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, saw their enrollments begin to dip as a result of forced integration. Now, do not get it twisted. I believe that integration and the legal eradication of legalized segregation was absolutely necessary and a God given right to any human being. However, the question becomes, do we as a people, are we as a people going to ignore the fact that you cannot change hearts through laws? You cannot change minds through laws. You can only change behaviors. Therefore, we must now, in response to this nation's attack on people of color, and that's what it is, and that attack is led by a man of color. It's led by what the man I call Uncle Sambo, uh, 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 Clarence Thomas, the, the biggest enemy to the Black community that I've ever seen. The man who wrote a concurring opinion in this decision eradicating or eliminating affirmative action. And in his concurrent opinion, he says, well, we must go to race neutral policies. Race neutral policies. If a Black man walks up to an admissions counter, I cannot hide the fact that I'm a Black man. It is not race neutral, no matter how you look at it. Clarence Thomas benefited from these policies when he went to his undergrad university, Williams and Mary, and likewise when he attended Yale. Clarence Thomas was one of the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. And then he later, after being dismayed at his not being hired by some of the white silk stocking law firms, Clarence Thomas turned and began to become the biggest enemy against the same policies, same people who stood up for him. Now, that begs the question, so where do we go from here? My friends, listen, I certainly am not one who advocates for a segregated society. To me, that doesn't make sense. However, the reality of this thing is that we must begin rebuilding and refocusing our attention on HBCUs. We must begin rebuilding and refocusing our attention on Black businesses within our own communities. That doesn't mean we don't shop in other communities. That doesn't mean we don't spend our money with white businesses. I can't tell you one Black person that would ever do that. to be honest with you. But the effort must be made to refocus our efforts and attentions on Black businesses, Black universities and colleges, and we've got to stop begging. They're not listening. This country has shown us what it thinks. This nation has undertaken policies over the past 20, 30 years going in the opposite direction of race neutrality. In the opposite direction. There is an all-out assault on the uh, on the Bill of Rights, on those constitutionally mandated rights that every single individual that is a citizen of this country, that is a citizen of any state or town within the boundaries of the United States, should enjoy. In Florida, in Florida, they are literally burning books that that have anything to do with telling the history of racism and segregation. And it's legal. In fact, they require every teacher, every librarian in a public school system to turn in a list of reading materials that will be housed at that or deposited in those learning institutions so that a censor can go through them and make sure that there is no discussion of the history of segregation and racial inequality in this country and in the state of Florida. They call it the critical race theory. Well, that's not what the critical race theory is. I'm not going to get into what it really is right now. But one thing's for sure, that we must be real with ourselves. We must stop lying to ourselves. We are under attack. We are no longer preferred legally by policy. And now that those policies are being systematically taken away, what are we going to do? Ask yourself, what will you do? What are you willing to do? We have had 50 years of access to loans and banks, access to money, access to jobs. Now, I didn't say that it was equal access. I said we've had access. Now, what are we going to do? Are we going to continue taking our wealth and spending it outside of our own communities? Are we going to continue sending our children to nothing but uh, uh, white universities, predominantly white universities, and these large state schools that didn't want us there in the beginning? I myself went to the University of Tennessee. When I was at the University of Tennessee, they had what they call a special admissions policy. It was an affirmative action policy. At that time, I wrote a commentary for one of the local newspapers. I think it was the Knoxville News Sentinel, whereby I criticized the university's policy on that because I felt it didn't go far enough. Out of 36,000 students, there were 1,800 Black students at the University of Tennessee when I went there. I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. But I share that experience with you so that you would understand that it was always an illusion. Affirmative action never eradicated and never eliminated racial discrimination in hiring or in college admissions. It looked good. It did allow some of us access that we probably might not have gotten when competing for those seats because the competition wasn't fair. But now the reality is this nation no longer has an appetite for remedial policies to wipe away its history of racial discrimination and segregation. So we must stand up and take care of ourselves. I don't care that the Supreme Court has eliminated the affirmative action policies. It wasn't working anyway. What we must do now is, as my youngest brother always says, we both are martial artists, and uh, I used to talk about some of because I'm a lot older than him, and I used to talk about some of the issues I would have with my body in fights because of my age. And he would always say, adjust to the handicap. I'll never forget that term, because we must now adjust to the handicap. I'm not calling the color of our skin a handicap. I'm calling the mentality of this nation a handicap. So we must adjust to that, and we must hit it head on, deal with it uh, in a manner in which we are not dependent on these kind of policies ever again. We must never become dependent upon these kinds of remedial policies ever again. Like welfare, certainly government controlled and government approved welfare was helpful in bringing some of us at least to a level of living that was decent. But when a community becomes dependent on those kinds of policies, what we actually are doing is handicapping ourselves. Why? Because the rug could be pulled out from under us at any time. Therefore, this decision by the U.S. Supreme Court and Sambo Clarence Thomas ought ought ring the bell. It ought sound the horn that it is time for us to stand up and begin addressing our problems from within our own community and not looking for outside assistance. That's our discussion for the day, my friends. Until next time, thanks for joining us at the Bailey Report.